Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 59 of the Raw Men podcast. And I'm gonna mess up the last name of my guest here. I'm gonna have her say it. I've never heard it pronounced. But we're talking to the founder and chair of Just a Snip. And she's here to talk to us about primarily male, but the issue is circumcision.
Thank
Lena,
you.
Lena, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's called Nyhus. It means new house, so you can just say new house.
I don't like the old tradition of Americanizing people's names.
Well, Nyhus.
Nyhus, okay.
Close enough.
Drat. All right. So I've got to ask, how did you first become interested in the topic or the controversy? I mean, did you ever at some point accept this this practice or this tradition? Were you always against it? I mean, tell me.
I think I sort of fell backwards into it. I've been interested in human rights as far back as I can remember, back into elementary school. And when I was a kid, the debate about circumcision, in that sense, female circumcision, it started in Europe and in Denmark. And I thought, well, excellent, they're going to outrule this practice for children. I never thought that it would be outruled for girls alone. And I always thought that someone else would deal with this because there were excellent doctors and legal minds involved in this discussion. And then as I became an adult, I realized that this wasn't going to happen. They had protected girls, but for some reason they didn't protect boys. And then a few years ago, in 2012, I saw a really, really interesting presentation by a Danish professor, adjunct professor Morten Frish, who has done a lot of studying and debating about male circumcision. And I realized that he had been fighting this battle for years, more or less on his own. And he was accused of absolutely horrible things, anti-Semitism and racism and fascism and you name it. He was
the big challenge with challenging the status quo is that the status quo has a lot of defenders that can be really harsh on that.
Yeah, and it was really it was difficult to see that someone who was just simply speaking his mind on this issue from an ethical perspective, but also as a medical professional, and a very, very highly regarded medical professional, that he would be attacked like that. And then shortly after that, in 2012, there was an article in an Israeli newspaper written by a Danish Jewish man. And he also made these claims that the circumcision debate in Denmark and Scandinavia had an undercurrent of anti-Semitism and fascism. And I just thought, that is simply not true. I mean, more than 70% of the Danes at that time were calling for an age limit. And Denmark is one of the countries in Europe with the lowest anti-Semitism and fascism rate. This is not about there's no discrimination at the basis of this issue. This is a children's rights and a human rights issue. So I entered the debate and wrote an opinion piece for this Israeli newspaper, and then I just sat back and waited for the shitstorm to happen. Mm-hmm. And to my great surprise, what happened was that I received messages and emails and tweets from men from all over the world who thanked me and who told me their personal stories. These were Egyptian and Syrian and Israeli and American and Norwegian and Danish men, men from all over the world, more than 200 messages telling me thank you. And there were some really, really horrible stories among them, they were isolated, they were depressed, some had physical complications, some had mental issues. It was even worse than I had imagined, and that it felt like an obligation when people bring that sort of trust to you.
Are we talking about people that were all circumcised as children?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, and I'm guessing at when most people are circumcised, I mean, it's like within days of birth. So I mean, nobody remembers the event.
No,
right?
that's an American tradition. In most other countries in the world, it happens later and at a time where the boy can remember it. So
That's
this
horrific.
tradition of infant circumcision is American, and of course it happens in Israel as well amongst the Jewish population. But for the rest of the world, the Muslim world, circumcision is predominantly in the age of 5 to 6, 7, 8.
And of course, there's no anesthetic in these, right?
In many cases, there certainly isn't any anesthetic involved. But that was what led to me founding what was just a Snip, which was just a blog at the time, and that led to a group of Danes founding Intact Denmark, which I'm chairing now, and we've decided to make Denmark the first country in the world to protect children of all genders from
I don't know if there's an
genital
American
mutilation.
I don't know if there's an American component of that, but I suspect the name U.S. Uncut is already taken.
Yeah. Well, you actually have quite a few very, very professional American organizations, which we've learned greatly from. And many of those organizations have been active for years and years, for decades. There's no circ, there's no harm, there's Intact America, which is the name that we've emulated. There's a number of very, very competent organizations that we've learned from. Absolutely.
Now I have to tell you, you're growing up in a religious community. I mean, I didn't even know that I was circumcised, since it's something that happened to me as a child and all this. And I had to find out later, what is this? What I realized is a scar later on. A curious feature. Why is it like that? I've been taught that we had to do this because there were health issues.
Yeah. That's a common myth.
Yeah, and of course, you get it from the religious community all the time when they have this tradition that the tradition, when you challenge that, then they pull out everything they can to try to defend it on some, give it some kind of justification. But as far as the religious justification goes, I mean, there's in the Coptic Gospels, there's the Gospel of Thomas. Which is, of course, not accepted as mainstream canon, but it's my favorite of the Gospels because therein there's a story about Jesus, and Jesus is asked whether he backs the practice of circumcision, and Jesus reportedly said that if God meant for you to have the foreskin removed, you wouldn't be born with it in the first place.
Yeah.
It seems logical to me.
Good. Absolutely. Actually, I did some research recently because Denmark is a monarchy, and the Queen, who's still alive, she just bought a huge and very, very expensive sarcophagus for herself for when she eventually dies, and she will be buried at this memorial. It's 29 million Danish kroner, which is a fortune. And she's having it placed in a chapel called, which is a chapel for the Holy Saint Bridget, I think you would call her in English. And she's actually a favorite saint of mine, even though I was raised in a Christian family, but I was never Christian myself. But she apparently had these visions of Jesus on the cross, and later on she had visions of tasting the foreskin of Jesus and going into but she did, and going into ecstasy, and she wrote a book about it. Because apparently the taste of the foreskin of Jesus is so sweet that it transformed all her limbs. That's what she wrote. And she became
any religious cult that wants to emulate that the way the Catholics do with the crackers in the body of Christ, you could start by just magically enchanting a bag of pork rinds.
Yeah, exactly. But actually they had apparently in the Middle Ages they had doctors all over Europe who were trained in tasting relics to see if it really was the foreskin of Jesus or whether it was just some cheap
How do you train someone?
Well, that's something I haven't learned yet.
Yeah, in what particularly Jesus's foreskin tasted like.
Well, the taste apparently was very sweet, but they were highly regarded, these doctors. But one monk thought that, of course, there couldn't be 18 relics of Jesus' foreskin floating around Europe in churches at the same time, which was actually the case. So he wrote a book about this stuff, and he argued that when Jesus, what's it called, when he died, and then 3 days later he did what? He ascended.
Yes.
Yeah. So he argued that the foreskin magically ascended together with Jesus, of course, and that it's now the rings of Saturn. So, well,
well,
this suddenly makes the Queen's sarcophagus a lot more interesting than it was to begin with.
Oh yeah, just thinking about the circumference of the rings.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but you learn something new every day. I think that's important, and that was news to me. But I will look at Saturn in a completely different light from now on.
So I looked into the practice of why people started doing that, and I didn't think that it was necessarily for health reasons. Although, living in an age when when you're sleeping on dirt, you don't have soap. Maybe that is an issue. We don't know. But it seemed that the practice just originated out of this religious tradition that itself didn't have a source. There was no reason for it. Supposedly Moses is going to be killed by God. God is coming to kill Moses because God couldn't figure out that this wasn't his prophet or whatever. You know how God keeps changing his mind even though he's everlasting and eternal. He comes to
and
kill
infallible.
Moses. Yeah. Except when he screws up and then has to apologize to Moses, which also happened. But regardless, he's going to come kill Moses, and to save Moses' life, Moses' wife chops off the foreskin of her son and then throws the foreskin at Moses' feet, and somehow this pleases God, and God decides not to kill Moses. And somehow God couldn't see that coming either, I guess. But how do you get this bizarre story saying, hey, I've got a great idea. Wait till, when take your child who's 6 or 7 years old and take a knife and cut off the tip of his penis. Why? Or we'll kill you. Cut off everybody's penis and then keep them in a sack and we'll use them as currency.
Yeah.
Like when we take over other countries or whatever, or other tribes, we'll bring back the proof in the form of this bag of foreskins. Isn't this wonderful? How bizarre can this be?
Yeah, the more you learn about it, it just becomes more and more ridiculous. But it does seem to have some of the sources that we know of, which goes way back before the Abrahamic religions. They seem to circumcise both males and females in order to remove the male part of the female, which is considered the clitoris, which is a phallus. And in the male, they will remove the foreskin, which is considered a type of vagina, which is the female part. So it's in order to separate the genders. That's some of the things that has been learned from animistic traditions.
So you're saying that religion has always had a hang-up with sex and there being only two genders. And
it seems so. It would seem so, yeah. But then later on, we know from the Egyptians, which is traditions that we know are at least 10,000 years old, that they would circumcise in order to mark their slaves, which they had conquered in war. So it's a very obvious way to mark your slaves if you take away their foreskin. It's a humiliation, and it's a very painful one at that.
how do we go from this painful humiliation to, as a means of identification, especially, to being practiced to everybody in the tribe or the kingdom or what have you? How is it identifying? How is it embarrassing then?
Well, if you look at the Torah and the Old Testament, it's the idea is that Abraham is supposed to sacrifice his son, and then God takes pity on him and tells him that instead of sacrificing his son, he can settle for handing over his own foreskin and the foreskin of his son, and everyone to come after them, including their slaves. It's not just a marking of himself and his own male descendants, but also of his slaves.
Because the Lord works in delirious ways.
Exactly. Yeah. So it seems to be a way to avoid child rituals, which could be considered ethical, but perhaps we've outlived that tradition, and we're ready to move on to something else. Perhaps I should just emphasize that as the chair of Intact Denmark, I personally I'm very strongly atheistic, but as an organization, we actually have a number of people of faith in the organization as well. We have Muslim members and Jewish members who are very strong in their faith. What we agree on is that faith is a personal issue. It's not something that you got into someone else's body. So many of the members of my organization will feel strongly about circumcision and would choose it for themselves. They would just never impose it on someone else. Just so that I have my my bearings straight in terms of my organization.
Well, then let me, and I'm glad that you pointed that out, because it is important, but I would ask you about these the stories that you were telling. If we separate away, I mean, I don't want this any of these stories to be something that people could say, well, if you'd only done that when it was days away from their birth, then they wouldn't have experienced this trauma. They wouldn't remember these sorts of things. So omitting those stories, or the stories that emanate from that, do you have any other stories that where somebody that had this done before they could remember it still had some negative effect from it?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, we have scientific studies which show that children do remember, even if they can't put traumatic experiences into words, they do form memories before they have a vocabulary. So we can see that any traumatic event, including circumcision, that happens in infancy will affect a child's ability to feel pain. So a child that's exposed to traumatic events in infancy will be more susceptible to pain during early childhood. So they will feel more pain during vaccination or other incidents during their childhood, and they will more likely be more careful. So it will affect their way of thinking and their way of negotiating the world, even if they don't have the words to tell us that they were traumatized early on. And this has been, studies have been done where groups have been compared. Children who suffered trauma in early infancy, children who suffered circumcision but no other trauma in early infancy, and children who suffered no type of trauma, including circumcision. And if you compare those three groups, you will see that the children who suffered early trauma and the children who suffered circumcision will have similar very high susceptibility to pain later in life. So that's actually, this is sad to see, but that's a fact. And also we have a lot of research which shows us physically that men who have been circumcised have a very high risk of suffering from different types of complications, not only at the actual time of the circumcision, but also later in life. For instance, meatal stenosis, I think it's called. It's a narrowing of the urethra that practically only exists in circumcised males. It almost doesn't affect intact males at all. And that is actually something that affects between 5 and 20% of circumcised males, whereas the intact population is hardly affected at all. So you guys live with this, and you have consequences.
Most of these things that you're talking about are things that, I mean, if you have circumcision as a child, you're not going to have a point of reference to compare. As far as, you know, with some things like, you know, your sensitivity either to pain or, you know, your sensitivity during sex, for example.
Yeah.
Are there any studies to show the difference that way?
Yes. Well, some of the studies reach different conclusions. It has to do with methods. But what we can say is that, well, let me just show you something. I'll do a little magic trick. It was developed for Danish politicians. I have a little piece of paper here, like this. Can you see? Yeah.
Yes.
This is roughly the size of a $1 note, I think.
Okay.
What many people don't know is that this is the size of the adult male's foreskin. Because the foreskin, when it's folded out, it has this size. But when it's attached to the penis and pulled forward like that, then it's double layered and it covers the glands, the head of the penis. But when it's pulled back, it will cover like this. Let me show you. Like that. It will cover the entire shaft of the penis. I don't know how whether you can see it properly on the screen, but that's how it will look. And that's actually roughly 50% of the surface of the penis, of the skin surface of the penis. And on the inside of that, when it's folded forward like this, there will be a mucous membrane on the inside, which also covers the head of the penis, the glands of the penis. And that mucous membrane is very similar to the mucous membrane we have on the inside of our eyelids or on the inside of our lips or other orifices. And the mucous membrane is supposed to be that soft and smooth because it meets the mucous membrane of the partner when you have sex. So there will be a very, very smooth sliding sensation. And that, of course, once the child is circumcised, that mucous membrane dies off and is replaced by a sort of calloused, dry skin, which is the body's way of protecting and forming a skin layer where the mucous membrane was supposed to be. That in itself will create a drier sensation. It will create, you know, normally the urethra is protected by the foreskin when in the pants or in bed linen and stuff, but the urethra opening will be exposed. And that's one of the reasons that we see these meatal stenosis cases. And also the entire, when the foreskin slides forth and back like this during sex, there will be a rolling sensation, which also gives stimulus during sex, whether it's with yourself and with a partner. And then there's the fact that about 50% of all sensory organs in the entire penis organ are actually situated in the foreskin. So you remove
50,
about,
did you say 50%?
yes, some studies even suggest that the number is higher, but yes, about 50%.
Now, you said
So
that you have people in your organization who have opted to be circumcised themselves as adults. Is that correct?
no, yes and no. We have people who have been circumcised at during childhood, but who believe that they would have opted to be circumcised themselves, and who raise their children in order to have that opportunity to opt for circumcision themselves when they become adult.
So
And then
are
we
you
have
aware? I'm sorry.
yeah, I just wanted to say that we also have people who have been circumcised later in life for medical reasons. So they have the experience of living with a foreskin up until their 30s and 40s. And then for these rare medical reasons, they've had to be circumcised later in life, and they have both experiences, yes.
So how do they report the comparison?
It seems that men who have been circumcised for involuntary reasons, for instance, medical reasons, will feel that it's a great loss. Whereas the men we've talked to who have been circumcised later in life by choice because they found it more aesthetically pleasing or for religious reasons or something like that, they will not feel that the foreskin is that much of a loss. So there's a very big psychological component as well.
Okay, so I have to expect that, and I learn this more and more all the time, that the people that watch my videos very often don't agree with whatever my position happens to be. And so to those people who are going to be arguing in favor of circumcision, I mean, what is the reason that they would give for, I mean, I'm not going to accept, if religion is your reason for doing anything, then you don't have a reason. But what if?
Well, some people would disagree with you.
I know. Lots of people. Most of the people are going to disagree with me on that point. But that's when I'm going to hold rigid on, because I've tested it out and I can defend that position. But what would I consider a reason that they would tell me that, you know, why you should why men should be circumcised?
Well, some men simply find that it makes for a more pretty penis. So they will opt for circumcision for aesthetic reasons. Some partners will find that it's more pleasing. And so there could be a sexual reason for that as well. Some have what we call a circumcision fetish. I've encountered a few people. It's very rare, but a few people who will have circumcisions performed for again and again. They will stretch the skin and then have a small circumcision performed and then stretch the skin again.
Well, let's when we talk about this, let's also bear in mind that we have people that will pierce their bodies in a number of ways, just for, you know, just to be extreme. And so that's probably what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it is extreme, but I mean, every whatever suits people.
But the reason that somebody gives for why they would be circumcised should not be the same reason as why they want to run a spike through their tongue. You know, is there a
Well, for some people, that is a valid reason. Some people will quote
when we're talking about
hygiene.
When we're talking about practicing, you know, you're performing this practice on everybody, and there has to be a different reason than that. Yeah,
but that was my end point, so to speak. So some people will claim that there's medical benefits from circumcision as well, but that's highly disputed, and the US is the only Western country which will advocate circumcision for medical reasons. No other Western country does this.
No other country advocates for
medical reasons. No.
Well, that was another thing I was going to ask you about. I mean, I was trying to imagine a medical condition that would require circumcision.
Yeah, that does happen. I mean, okay, perhaps I've perhaps I can find a better wording. There can be medical conditions which require circumcision. They're rare, but they exist. But prophylactic circumcision, the US is the only country, Western country, which advocates prophylactic circumcision. The circumcision of a healthy individual. That's the only country where that is advocated. That doesn't happen in other Western countries. But we do circumcise in Denmark for medical reasons. It's rare, but it does happen. It will be less than 0.5% of the male population will need a circumcision for medical reasons during their lifetime. So that's a very rare situation.
I asked you earlier about men who had reported things that were not necessarily connected to what they could remember, but just side effects of say something that they're not conscious of. They don't have a conscious memory of the act, but they still report a side effect of it. You answered that by going into studies. Yeah. But you didn't actually give me somebody's story. Do you have a story that's
absolutely? We have a number of members who have. It's actually a compilation of complications which we see in many circumcised men. They will have dry and calloused skin. They will have lower sensitivity. Some people who have been circumcised can experience pain during erection and sex. Sometimes their frenulum will tear. The little triangle underneath the head of the penis is called a frenulum. Some circumcised men don't have that because it's been removed during circumcision, but intact men and some circumcised men will have the frenulum, and in some cases it tears. And then there's the meatal stenosis that they report, which is that the urethra narrows, and that means that they can suffer. It can be difficult to empty the bladder. They can have when they urinate. It can be a very slow and very weak. What's it called?
We can call it an elimination.
Yes, let's call it that. And also that means that sometimes the urine backs up, so it can lead to more serious conditions, kidney conditions and other conditions. So this is actually not a small thing. It can be something that can follow people through life and lead to quite serious conditions. And now, a few of our members have their sensitivity is so decreased that it's actually not possible for them to have any sensation in the penis at all during intercourse.
Wow. Okay. Now I've heard other horror stories about people that would do some terrible damage, just accidentally do terrible damage to, and we're talking about an infant now being circumcised, and even including situations where a child's penis is cut in half.
Yes, and we've seen that too. Yeah.
And then other stories getting into the religious practice of it, where they do the thing where the rabbi ducks down to suck the blood off, and then you have babies that caught herpes from.
Yes, yeah, that is something that we don't really see in Europe. That's something that you see in the US, primarily in the Hasidic communities in New York, and then it's seen in Israel. But the tradition of sucking the open wound of the penis after the circumcision is only performed in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities today.
Okay. So we adopted this practice, and for reasons I didn't understand, and I remember.
Well, that was Harvey Kellogg, the cornflakes guy. It's true. You had a number of doctors, 10, 12 doctors in the US, Kellogg being one of them. And he actually advocated circumcision as a means to cure blindness and syphilis and masturbation and a number of other things.
Well, as
and
long
he
as there's good, solid science behind it.
Exactly, yes. And he actually advocated that it should be done without anesthesia, because the idea was that the more painful, the better, so that this area would only be associated with procreation, not enjoyment.
I've never understood what it is that deeply religious people have against enjoying sex. I mean, because you certainly meet a lot of people a lot of really religious people who enjoy sex, but the religion itself has all kinds of admonitions against it, and there's quite a lot of people that are in these religions that, because of their religion, have this huge issue with it. And why do they encourage suffering so much? And again, we're talking primarily, I'm American, so we're talking exclusively, in my case, about children, infants.
Yeah.
And so we have issues about bodily autonomy, right? I mean, where does a child get? I suggested once upon a time, when I was listening to people talk about, overpopulation being this huge issue, and starvation being a huge issue. And I remember, as a boy myself, I remember thinking, I was just a little kid at the time, and I remember suggesting that they have some, I think reversible vasectomies had just become a thing that could happen. And I thought, well, so I was like 12 years old, and I suggest, well, what if they do that? Every kid born has a reversible surgery. I'm treated like I'm some sort of Nazi experimental surgeon for suggesting such a horrific thing be done. But how is that significantly different?
Yeah, it really isn't. Yeah. But what we could do is that we could enjoy all the sex that we want and simply use condoms. This is really, really simple. But to some religious communities, that's not the case. Actually, let me just show you this book, which is a Danish book called With or Without Peel, like a banana, and it's about circumcision. But we had, there was a number of people interviewed for this book, rabbis, imams, etc. And the imam was asked, why do you think that circumcision is necessary? And he said, circumcision has many advantages, primarily hygiene-wise, the religious purification, aesthetics. And then he says, and then it has the advantage that you can control your urges by being circumcised, because, as we say, if the urge is uncontrollable, we will be like the animals. So he's arguing that men can't control their own sexuality without having part of their penis cut off. I think it's a very I think it's a nasty way to look at men, actually. Well, I think it's a disgusting way to look at men.
I agree with you, and I also have to wonder about all of these people who, for whatever reason, say, and again, it's always the devoutly religious who say that men cannot control their urges or shouldn't be expected to be able to control their urges, and so women need to cover up.
Yes.
Yeah.
This imam argues that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so why don't we have responsibility for ourselves? I don't get that. I mean, I've said before, I mean, I could lay down, a beautiful woman could lie down next to me naked, and if there's not an invitation to engage, then that's not going to happen. If there's no,
exactly. There has to be consent. It's really that simple.
It sounds like the people that are making these arguments that are afraid of being like the animals are very much like the animals already. And it sounds a little bit like the argument that, if they didn't have their belief, well, they would just run around killing and raping everything. Like,
luckily, I think in Denmark and in Europe, generally, we don't hear a lot of that type of arguments. It's not mainstream. The majority of the European societies are highly secularized, so you can't get away with making that sort of arguments, at least mainstream. So we don't encounter that politically. We don't encounter that sort of thing in the debate very much. We will see it sometimes if we talk one-on-one, but it's not an argument that we will encounter in the media. And
Yeah, I
this
remember.
is.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm listening. Yeah.
I just remember reading an old story from like 700 years ago or thereabouts about somebody coming from Medina who went to Constantinople, and he saw women that didn't have their hair bound up, and so this is like the first time he's seen women's hair down and free. So the first woman he sees like this, the first Christian woman he sees like this, he falls in love with her because he has no control over himself. And so in a very isolated community, you might actually have a belief like that, or
Absolutely.
maybe in a restricted society where you've never seen ankles before, maybe that could be a thing. But then we've got this counter experiment where you can go down like Venice Beach, California, and you can see all the flesh you want.
Yeah.
And yet we don't have people running around like crazed animals. Funny thing.
Exactly. But generally in the Danish debate, the only religious argument that we will meet is that this is a highly meaningful ritual which introduces the child to the community. That's the argument that's made.
I'm sorry,
that we're removing the child from the family and the religious community if we disallow circumcision. So that's what we're hearing.
That is about as empty an explanation as I could imagine. So
well, I think it's very sad if your child has to have a mutilated penis to be part of the family, then I think you have to question your family values more than the child's penis.
Yeah, and they also have these admonitions in the Bible, where the Bible constantly contradicts itself, where if you have a mutilated penis, you're not allowed to come before God. Or maybe it's not the penis necessarily, it's mutilated testicles, and you're not allowed to come before God, because God is really weird about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Don't ever have one of those kind of accidents or you're out of the club.
Yeah.
So when I became a father myself, I was always iconoclast. I was always questioning why we have these kind of traditions, but I was talked into allowing, because I don't really know. I hadn't studied this, really. I mean, I didn't know what the advantages, disadvantages. This is common practice. Everybody does it. The whole country does it. And I'm the only person that ever asked, why are people doing this? I'm just kind of told to shut up. This is what we do. We're all doctors here, and the hospital will authorize it and all that. So I'm not getting an answer. And to be completely honest, I didn't investigate it when I think I should have, and I feel bad about it. Now my son doesn't. He has no memory of the incident. He says he's fine, and he's completely down with whatever happened to him, and I'm not. I'm not, because that wasn't my choice.
Yeah, I completely understand that. Yeah.
I didn't do the research, and that's my fault. But I mean, it's not his fault. How could he have?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm not entirely.
I can understand that as a parent myself. I can definitely understand that regret.
So weighing the pros and cons here, if that's even a thing. I mean, in my perspective, I've got no reason except an extreme condition that would require that you do this. An extreme rare circumstance that would require that. The religious reasons are not reasons. They're ridiculous excuses. So what we've got is you have a possibility that uncircumcised you might have an issue, and circumcised you might have an issue. Can we just do a direct comparison there? Yeah,
well, then the risk of having an issue will be significantly higher for the circumcised male than for the intact male.
Do we have
the
data
intact male? Yeah, we do actually, because there's been a lot of studies internationally, but also we've seen some very significant Danish studies. The Danish studies are very strong because in Denmark, each person is registered with a personal security number when we're born. And any diagnosis that you have will be connected to your number throughout your life. So all diagnoses that you will have during your entire lifetime will be it'll be possible to perform a direct study on those diagnoses. So we know for every single child born in the Copenhagen area, or who lived in the Copenhagen area in 2014, Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark, whether they needed any type of genital surgery or not. So we know that at the very most 1.7% of the male population at that time would need any type of genital surgery. And by comparison, we know that for one of the many complications which can occur in circumcision is the meatal stenosis, which is that narrowing of the urethra. And that will affect between 5 and 20% of males. So the risk of complication in connection to the circumcision is by far exceeding the risk of having an entire penis.
I would ask you to provide a link for that, but I know that in the discussions of in the comment sections of these videos, people are going to be hashing out and throwing links back and forth at each other.
Yeah.
For anybody that might want to look this up, do you have any keywords that they can search for?
Yes. The study that I mentioned with needing any type of surgery is called Sneppen and Thorup 2016. So that's a very new study, and I'll provide the link. And also yesterday, actually, a new study on meatal stenosis was published. Actually, I think I have it right here. It's by Professor Morten Frish. Let me see if I have another. Just a second here, I have it. And since it was published yesterday, let me see. I don't have the American title here, but I can find that for you. And it was published in The Surgeon, so that's I believe a very respectable American or British medical journal.
And the one
quite
thing we
significant numbers.
I very much appreciate those links and
absolutely.
Thank you so much for that. The last thing we hadn't talked about is, I mean, the common practice here in the United States of doing this in infancy, and the fact that you can't actually have anesthetic in infancy. I have to think about, what you want to have this moment of precious bonding, and you want to interrupt that with a ritual like this. I mean, it's quite a different thing than having to get an inoculation, vaccinations. I don't think vaccinations are ever done that soon, are they? They don't.
At least not in Denmark. I'm not familiar with the American.
And they're never that painful. I mean,
No. A circumcision is allegedly one of the most traumatic events that you can expose a child to, because it's probably the most sensitive part of the male physique. And as you say, since it's done with only inadequate or no anesthesia at all, it's highly traumatic. It's actually a violent episode, which is interesting because the UN High Commissioner has a special rapporteur on violence towards children, and they have actually recommended that male circumcision of healthy children is discontinued because it constitutes violence towards the child. We've actually, yeah, I'm listening.
I'm sorry. I keep cutting you off. I don't know if there's a delay.
Well, I do too. So never mind.
Well, you mentioned that you started this in Denmark, or maybe there was a predecessor in your following, but it begun in Denmark, and you said there's also a sister group in the United States, and you mentioned that there was a couple of other people elsewhere. Is there like a global movement in this direction? I mean, what do you see there?
Well, I think there is. I think it's small. It's but but there is a movement. I mean, in the US, you've seen a fall in the circumcision rates, which is quite significant. In the 80s, in the US, you had circumcision rates which were more than 95%, whereas now you're down to 50-60%. So in the US, even though there hasn't been a very public debate about this, you've seen a rapid decline in circumcision rates. And in Denmark and Scandinavia, where I come from, the circumcision rate is about 5%. And here the debate is very vocal. Also because in Denmark, it's not allowed, and in Scandinavia, you're not allowed to spank your children. We don't smack children. We don't verbally abuse our children. If you do that, your children will be removed. Violence towards children, physically or even verbally, is not allowed. So to us, it's just for the entire population, it's just a very, very simple next step that, of course, you shouldn't cut into the healthy child. And in Denmark, 87% of the population supports an age limit of 18 for circumcision. But
And
we've
that makes
actually
sense.
Yes, it's completely rational and not logical. But we've actually just handed in this report here to the UN Children's Rights Committee. It's one of our members on the front page. He's called Ayhan Akole. Ayhan is a medical doctor, and he was circumcised himself. And up until recently, he supported male circumcision for cultural reasons. But then he looked into the issue, to the medical data, but also looked into the ethics of the issue. And now he's our poster boy for this anti-circumcision campaign. But this is not just the position and an opinion that we have. This is also supported by practically all the Danish medical communities, the Danish Medical Association, the surgeons associations, the midwives, the healthcare providers. They all support an age limit at the age of majority, and that goes for the Children's Council, which is a sort of a semi-stately children's rights organizations, sort of a children's ombudsman, you could call it. It goes for Save the Child in Denmark and other children's rights organizations.
The religious members in your organization, you said that you had Jews, you had Muslims, you had I presume Christians, and that agree with the idea of circumcision for cultural reasons or what have you, so long as it's done at an age of consent. Because when you start trying to argue against circumcision within the United States, the first thing that all the believers are going to do is say that their beliefs, their cultural traditions or whatever are being compromised. Right?
Yeah, we hear that too. Yeah.
So what do you have to say to somebody that makes that kind of an argument?
Well, what we say is quite simply that religious freedom is a very strong and very important right. The right to believe anything you want is your personal human right, and that goes for children as well. But if you carve your belief into someone else's body, then you've transgressed that. Then it's not your right and your belief anymore. Then it's you violating someone else's rights. And children are human beings in their own right. Yeah. And they have the right to form their own opinions, whether that's circumcision or not. Personally, I'm not a fan of circumcision because I genuinely appreciate the functions of the foreskin as a partner as well. But I will support any adult who will choose, who makes an informed choice and chooses circumcision for himself. And I will join him and I will hold his hand, not his pecker, but his hand, if he has it done. If it's his choice, I will support that. there's no religious freedom in forcing your opinion on someone else.
Well, that's a problem, because in the United States, religious freedom is all about enforcing your opinion on other people. I mean, I've had people tell me that allowing gays to be married is somehow a violation of the religious people's rights. How is that even a thing? I would ask them. I mean, how does that even relate to you? How does somebody else you don't know getting married to another person of the same sex have any impact on you at all? And the answer that I got was that they can't impose their religious beliefs on everybody else. Then that is an infraction on their, because that's their religious obligation, is to impose their rule on everyone else. So when you have a child, that child is not viewed culturally, is not viewed as an individual who's free to make up their own choices and choose not to believe what the parents believe. The parents stamp that when that child is born, that child has all of the same religious perspectives and sub-denominations as the parents do, and that's how the way they're expected to be raised. And if you try to tell them anything that we can verify to be true, for example, well, then we are infringing again on the parents' right to delude their child before they reach the age of reason.
Well, I can't help thinking that the US ambassador to Denmark, Rufus Gifford, he was just married in Copenhagen to his husband. So some people from the US might have that opinion, but I'm happy to say that not all Americans think so, and we appreciate it to be able to be the country where they chose to be married. Denmark was actually the first country to allow homosexual partnership. Official partnership. Not the first country to allow homosexual marriage, because it's two different processes, but civil partnership, yes. Okay. So they were married at the Copenhagen City Hall.
Well, that's outstanding. And of course, not all Americans are the way I just described them. I myself am an American. There are a precious few that I know that have the same opinion that I do on most things. But you know what I'm saying about American culture being, well, it's a little over the top on too many subjects, and a little myopic.
Yeah, I could certainly at the moment, from a European perspective, it does seem somewhat over the top. But there was another thing. What was that? I was just I was rewinding to what we were talking about the medical organizations.
Yes.
One of the Danish medical organizations, which was one of the first to issue a statement on this issue 3 years ago, just after Intact Denmark was formed, they actually stated that any surgical intervention on a healthy person which isn't able to consent constitutes mutilation. So the circumcision of a healthy child is mutilation, and that was the wording that they used. And that's the same wording that we have in the Bioethics Convention, which is also about consenting to medical interventions. And I think this is important. Of course, you can't the mere idea of cutting into another person's healthy body without their consent is absolutely ridiculous to me. I have no words for how appalling that thought is.
We are of similar opinion, and it's going to be fun to see how the comments play out on this.
Yes, I will look forward to that. When do you expect to publish this?
It'll be up in a few days.
Okay.
I'm just I have some other things that I'm uploading, and I don't want everything to be all done at the same time. So I mean, this will go live just in a couple of days. Mm-hmm. Lena, I want to thank you very much for being on.
Well,
I want to make sure also that you've been able to say or to share everything that you came prepared to say. And have we covered everything?
So. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Links to contact you or for your organization or whatever, I will share those below. And is there anything else we need to add on? I'm just going to let you.
Well,
make
one
closing
thing I would
comments.
love to say, which might be completely off topic, and you can just cut it out if you dislike it. But what we're doing here in Denmark is actually we're trying to make world history, but we're doing it with a budget of $3,000 to $4,000 a year. So if anyone out there feels that this is a topic that they think should be promoted, contributions would be high.
Okay, well, I don't know what happened. We seem to have lost that connection. As I said, I'm going to put all the links in here. I also wanted to mention that she'd also spoken to the UN. She'd mentioned that to me, and I think it was about this. I mean, so I was certainly happy to have her on. I'm sorry that there seems to be a communication or a computer failure, maybe an internet connection failure, and I think it was on her end. At least it enables me to stop the show normally. So thank you, Lena, for being on. Good night, everyone.